in at our interim location, 129 Boyden Avenue, adjacent to the pool parking lot. Grab and Go Holds pickup is available for all Maplewood cardholders at both buildings, and both buildings are open 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Friday and Saturday. The main library at 51 Baker Street is officially closed and is being prepared for construction. If you would like more information on our plans to build a library for the 21st century or how you can support this amazing project, please visit the Maplewood Library Foundation website at www.maplewoodlibraryfoundation.org. And now to this evening's program, Making Live Radio in a Podcast World, a conversation with WNYC's Kai Wright and Nancy Solomon. Kai Wright is a veteran journalist who created a podcast, The United States of Anxiety, and turned it into a live radio show. Nancy Solomon is the managing editor of New Jersey Public Radio. They'll touch on the impact of podcasting on public radio and what it takes to put a live show together. I would just like to add that Nancy has been a wonderful friend to the library, and tonight marks her 5th event with us. So please put your questions in the Q&A and give a warm welcome to Nancy and Kai. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda, and hello, everybody. It's a little weird because we don't see you, but I trust you're seeing us. So I look forward to the day when we can do these in the basement of the library like we used to. I guess I'll do a little more of a broader introduction of Kai. He's the host and managing editor, as Amanda said, of the United States of Anxiety. And before that, he was involved in versions of that podcast that was the United States of Anxiety, or and before that, it was There Goes the Neighborhood. And he also was involved in CAUGHT, The Lives of Juvenile Justice, another award-winning, DuPont-winning podcast at WNYC. Kai was also the host of Indivisible, which was a national live radio call-in show that WNYC put together in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And that was an effort to bring voices from across the political divide together on the air. And he is the author of Drifting Toward Love, Black, Brown, Gay, and Coming of Age on the Streets of New York, as well as 2 other surveys of Black American history. The amazing thing I can tell you about Kai is that despite how accomplished he is, he's actually like a tremendously nice guy. So I salute you, Kai. I love you, and I'm so glad you're doing this tonight. So tell us your WNYC origin story and like how you got here. And I'd actually like you to start with what you wanted to be when you grew up.
Well, I'll go all the way back to what I wanted to be when I grew up. But first, I have to say, left out of that bio was my WNYC origin story, which was being edited by one Nancy Solomon, and my first ever audio work doing a series of reports on the first year of the Affordable Care Act in Newark. And that is how I learned and fell in love with this work, I will have to say. Nice. I was a print journalist. I had never done anything in audio in my life other than show up largely on WNYC and run my mouth about the stories that I wrote. And I had been recruited to by our former colleague, Mary Harris, who is now the host of Slate's daily news podcast, What's Next, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And she was launching, she was piloting the what became our health show, our health podcast, Only Human. And she needed a guinea pig to come in and, as she put it, play on the mic. And I showed up to play on the mic thinking, oh, that sounds fun, and discovered that what she meant was, can you be the host of this pilot? And I was like, what does that mean? And so we did that. And at the end of it, I was like, that was fun. And they were like, well, Nancy needs a reporter to do this series on the Affordable Care Act. You want to give it a shot? And I had been a health reporter. So I owe all of so I say all that jokingly, but also quite seriously. My audio work, which I never ever dreamed of doing for 20 previous years in journalism, is owing to the fact that you and Joe Capriglione, who was the producer, worked with me, just bit me with the addiction of getting people's voices. But I don't know. I never wanted to be anything other than a journalist. I worked when I was 15 years old. I got an internship at the Black community newspaper in my hometown in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I remember being able to like go up. I think it was my pastor I first interviewed. I went to one of these great big churches, but I remember being able to go up and ask questions, and they have to be answered. And I thought, well, that's for me, and so that's all I have ever wanted to do. I went through a brief period where I thought I was going to be a PhD in comparative politics focused on Islamist movements. But that passed quickly, and I've been doing this pretty much my whole life.
Well, and let's start in on some of the podcasts. So the United States of Anxiety was, of course, a podcast before it was a show, and we'll talk more about it becoming a show later. But the first season of the United States of Anxiety was, in my humble opinion, just brilliant. And I think, it's hard to remember back to that moment before Trump was elected, when we didn't really understand who these Trump voters were. And the United States of Anxiety was one of the first shows that actually, where you had reporters who went out and spent time with people who were going to vote for Trump. And we really started to understand what was going on in like this phenomenon. So to tell us a little bit about that, because that must have been, I mean, how did that idea evolve, and how did how did all of that come about?
Well, a few things, and it's at this point it is hard to sort of know what's what in hindsight and what we knew at the time. It can be hard to disentangle. But I'll say, one of the things is it at some point became cool to say, oh, I always knew Trump was going to win, and and I don't need to know anything more about these Trump people other than what I know, which is that they're racists, right? And that sort of became a thing that people started saying post the election. And I have never agreed with that. I felt from the beginning that whatever was true, that this was a meaningful movement of people that were going to define the next era of our lives, and that whether or not they're racist, and I do think racism is a significant, if not at this point, total part of that movement. It's a necessary but insufficient label. You have to understand what exactly is going on in this moment in our time and in our culture and our communities that would give rise to a movement like this. And so we had been making, as you said, There Goes the Neighborhood, which was a podcast about gentrification in Brooklyn. And it was a lot about, this sort of miasma of gentrification that overshadowed Brooklyn, but no one really understood like how it worked. And we were really obsessed with the backstory, with the history of how neighborhoods got formed in the first place. And we spent a lot of time learning and thinking about white flight out of Brooklyn and Queens and into the Long Island suburbs. And that was on our minds as a consequence as we went into the 2016 election. And we started putting two and two together, and saying, wow, this movement of Trump voters is suburban, largely affluent, upper middle class and middle class people who are really aggrieved and overwhelmingly white. And they look an awful lot like the people we've been thinking about who left Brooklyn and Queens a generation ago. And so it was a reporting project in which we didn't know what was going to come out of it. We just were, it was, I think, in my humble opinion, some of the best of public media, in the sense of like, we didn't need to know what the audience was going to be. We didn't need to know anything other than we had a set of questions. And we gathered, you might remember, in a conference room we call 8 White. It's our big conference room at WNYC. And it was me and you and our now current co-editor, Karen Frillman, and Jim Schachter, who was the vice president of news at the time. And somebody, it may have even been you, Nancy, said, Long Island is basically purple. Long Island, if you took it outside of New York City, would be a swing state. And so that would be a great place to go report a question like the one you have. So we said, let's go to Long Island, report it, and see what happens. So we didn't know what we were getting into. We didn't know what we would find. And we just sort of made it week after week. It almost seems like the halcyon days of podcasting, where you didn't have to have a big plan and spin out, and how is it going to land at number one and all the rest. We just reported the story. And we found what we thought were remarkable things, that were about the depth of the loss of innocence in the white suburbs. And that was what had pushed people a generation or 2 generations ago into those suburbs in the first place, was the search for innocence. And now it had been lost. And there was a rupture there that was resonant with all of the Trump voters that we talked to.
So tell folks a little bit about what it means to put together a podcast like the United States of Anxiety, or There Goes the Neighborhood. I mean, there are, there's more than 1 million English language podcasts, and I'd say maybe 999,000 of them are people who turn on the mic and start talking. And then there's the podcasts that we do that are much more produced. So just talk a little bit about how you figure out how to put all that together, because it is kind of extraordinary that it comes together in the end.
I have no idea the questions you asked. I mean, one thing I'll say is, it's just like to appreciate how much, and it relates to the answer, is there are 1 million, however many number, there were a infinitesimal fraction of that 4 years ago. Certainly when we made There Goes the Neighborhood, certainly when we made the first season of United States of Anxiety, even, every year, I don't know that audio listeners appreciate just how dramatically the amount of content grows annually in this space. And that is relevant because it means that you have less room to just play if you want to find an audience for your work. And so we continue. So we have to continue to be more and more creative about how are we going to report this story, and how are we going to communicate this story in a way that, in the midst of all that noise, those million podcasts, all that noise, the people who really want it can actually find it. And so that thinking on all of those levels at once is challenging. And which is to say, we have done it different. Literally everyone. We've made 5 seasons. We made 4 seasons of United States Anxiety before we moved to making it as a live radio show. Each and every single one of them was an entirely different podcast and required an entirely different approach. So the first season, the approach was was literally just a reporting project, just like an old school reporting project, like you would have had on any other. And it just the distribution platform happened to be this thing called podcasting. By the time, even a year later, by the time we got to the second one, we were like, well, we need an overarching idea here that people can hold on to. And we came up with a really large one around the sweep of history is behind every one of these debates we're having. And so that meant, to do something that large, I couldn't report each one of those myself. Me and one other person, we had to have a different reporter work on each and every one. And we were blessed to be in a newsroom full of reporters and producers, so we could beg, borrow, and steal each one of you to, make one episode of the podcast, because one episode would take, weeks, if not months, to really report out. By the time we got to the next season, we were like, all right, we can't, we can't ask that much of our colleagues. It's not their jobs, and so that's when we focused on gender and power, because it was for the 2018 elections, and gender seemed to be the most salient part of that conversation. And so we turned to you and others to say, okay, what are you already so then our theory became, what are our colleagues already reporting out that we can then shape into longer form than they would have the opportunity to do in their morning edition pieces, in their conversations with Brian, to be able to stretch their legs, to be a little more narrative. So that's how we did that one, So we've had to kind of reinvent the wheel each time, both to sort of match the subject we want to make, but also the realities of making these things in such a chaotic and crowded and fast moving time.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things that I think probably every radio reporter who works in public radio loves about getting an opportunity to work in a podcast is that we're so constrained by time and the clock for live radio. And, most people don't realize, but like for the WNYC newsroom, we produce feature stories that go into All Things Considered or Morning Edition. And that means we have to work with their clock. We pull out one of their stories and we put in ours. And so we've got like 4.5 minutes or 7.5 minutes. And those are the two kind of lengths of story we can do. So,
and not 7 minutes and 20 seconds and not 7 minutes and 54
exactly.
seconds,
Yeah.
but exactly 7.5 minutes.
Exactly, including the host intro. To be freed up and to be able to spend 20 minutes on a story is just fantastic. And I think, that's one of the things I think both listeners really enjoy about podcasts and the makers of podcasts really enjoy is this ability to spin things out and have a little more time.
And some lead time. I mean, you get less and less as you get the
Mhm.
demands. We all have jobs, productivity, and all of that, but we do get more time also to develop it. You get more. That's one of the beauties of this part of the work is you got a little more time to sort of, is this right? I don't know. Is that the story? I don't think that's quite the story. I think the story's over here. And that, I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about it.
Yeah. And just to remind our audience tonight, the gender and power and women one, my participation in it was about our own local suburban activists in, all around us, Soma Action and NJ 11th for Change. And it was I had been reporting on this just incredible rise of activism among suburban women, and which became decisive in the 2018 election. But we were sort of tracking it early on, and so that became, one of the things that we did. So that was really great, and I just wanted to tell our New Jersey people
and really well received. And it was something that people were so hungry for, and it's what we were, why we were drawn to that reporting and what we were trying to do in that series, and what we're always trying to do in the United States of Anxiety was go from like these big important, like these big sweeping ideas that are dominating our political conversation and get them as small as possible in terms of, how people are moving through the world in them. Get them as small and intimate as possible. And that's what you were doing in that work and what we were trying to do in that season. We're just like, can we just be on this block? Can we just be in this living room? Can we just be with this person? And through that, be able to understand why Congress is going to change this session or not in this election.
So you started to, as the podcast continued to kind of have each iteration and move along, at a certain point, history becomes kind of an important focus for you, and so talk about that a little bit. Like how did it come about that you wanted to incorporate, because oftentimes we do a lot of work where we don't really spend a lot of time on the history and we stay very current. So where did that come from?
Honestly, what's happened is we're just naming it more than that it's changed. We just said, yeah, we do a lot of history, because we were just doing it without naming that all along. I have all throughout my career as a journalist, when I was in print, I would always have this experience where I would write, because I used to write these long magazine articles, right? And then I would sit and they would go to my editor, and my editors would go through it. And there would always be that section of the piece where you're like, okay, here's the backstory, and you want to go. And that was always my favorite part, and the part that would be the first to be cut in the edit, right? Because it's like, there's not enough room here. This is dragging it down. People are, everything, you're supposed to, this is news, you're supposed to be moving forward. That is, and I don't disagree with that. Like, part of what we do is we're helping people look at what's coming. That's the job, and so, like, when you don't have enough space, the first thing to go is those background paragraphs. Get that out of there. It's slowing things down. And that has been a frustration for me my entire journalism career, because those are the paragraphs I'm most interested in. And so one of the joys of podcasting was, again, because we didn't have to be 7 minutes, we could be whatever number of minutes we wanted. I was allowed to keep those paragraphs in, and so even in the first season, I kind of became the history correspondent. Our colleague Arun Venugopal was the lead reporter. I was reporting as well, but he was the lead reporter going into Long Island, developing. Most of the characters and voices you heard were people that he went out and developed relationships with and got them to open up in really surprising and unexpected ways. And I was coming in to give the backstory to what you just heard, and that wasn't intentional. It just sort of, that's what started happening, because I would hear a piece of Arun's tape and I'd be like, that reminds me of this thing I read once, and I'm going to call that professor up and see what they say. And then we'd be like, well, we might as well record it. And then well, that was a great conversation. Let's include it, because our editor, Karen Frillman, is also a history buff and loves the backstory. And so it's just kind of always been how we process the news, is like, wait, how did we get here? How did we get here? And so as the show has gone on, we started getting a lot of feedback. When you run into audiences or do audience surveys or be out in the world at events like this, when we used to do these things in person, and then at the end, somebody would come up from the audience and be like, what I love is when you give the history part, and we heard so much of that we were like, oh, we should own this. Yeah, that's what we do. Let's name it, and so it's really been more an evolution of just putting a name to what we already do. And again, just to say, one of the reasons, I personally, again, it's a wonderful and important thing that we do about helping people look forward, but it is also one of the things that erodes the conversation in America, particularly political conversation, is because there are so many political actors who are invested in an ahistoric democracy, who are invested in voters and people who are engaged in public life in any way, forgetting what happened yesterday, and that is part of their political agenda. And I mean that really across the political spectrum. It is most acute on the right, but it is across the political spectrum that erasing history is a part of American politics. And so I have an ideology of, you can't really have these conversations without knowing what was the last thing. Because what we're doing now was in reaction to what just happened before, which was in reaction to what just happened before, which was in reaction to what just happened before. And so you have to keep that in the conversation if you're actually going to move forward in a sensible way. So it's an ideological thing for me, but also just sort of how our minds work of the people on the team, and it seems to land well with our audience. So,
well, and in fact, I happen to know that the audience research that WNYC has done, that one of the areas that people say they are interested in, but they don't have many options for podcasts that they can listen to, and that in that area is history. And so hopefully we're going to be getting even more historically rooted podcasts out of WNYC studios.
Indeed. And I'll say one more thing on the issue. I mean, for us, for the sort of our perspective, so it's also a very particular perspective on history. that I hope, that I think is the kind of thing that WNYC can be a great addition to is it's social history. You don't hear a lot in our show, history of the great man or great woman, but it's usually, you don't hear a lot of that of the history of powerful people. We're looking for, we're telling social histories of what happened on that block in East New York in 1980, whatever, we're looking for histories of you and me and us, to explain the world, not histories of power. And that is intentional. And I think it's the kind of thing that when public media takes on history, is the kind of history we can tell. Because it's in a commercial space, that's a hard thing.
Yeah.
Commercial spaces, there's a reason why all the big blockbuster history books and history shows are all about great leaders, because they're sexier and they sell better.
Yeah. Well, there was Hamilton. That worked out pretty well.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want to invite everyone to put your questions in the Q&A location. I don't know what to call that thing. And I'll just keep asking until we populate that list a bit more. So now let's move into the last year or so, because I know that, obviously big changes happened. And so you took a podcast and made it into a live radio show, which is really pretty much the opposite of every other show.
People are supposed to do.
So how did that happen?
I wake up every day and be like, wait, you did what? Why? But it's not unrelated to the big changes that happened in the world. There was many things I love about podcasting, but there are many things about it that are frustrating to me. It is a one-way communication too often. It is too often encourages people to say, to engage with it as, for me, the maker, I've gone off and I've done this precious thing and I've delivered it to you, and then you're going to consume it, and then that's the end. And I think that leads to passive listening too often, where people can sort of consume something, have an emotional experience about it, and check the box of that great issue. And my work has always been about, and I think our work at WNYC is much more about engagement. We're looking for active listening. I want you to engage with me and the work I'm doing and say, okay, well, that leads me to do this, or that leads me to ask this of the person next to me, or that I carry that forward. I don't just say, oh yeah, okay, I get it. That was about racism. Okay, now I'm going to move on. Or isn't that sad what happened to that person? Now I'm going to move on. I have empathy for them. That's the end. That is not the goal of the work. I'm really invested in active listening. And I come from, I should say, my print journalism, I come from a line of journalism that is about news for action. That is the world from which I come, community-driven media that's about what are we going to do in our community together. And so when the shutdown happened, when COVID hit, and we were at the beginning of what would be the fourth season of United States of Anxiety, and we had this long storyboard, which is still, it's so funny. If you ever get a chance, maybe probably won't have this chance, but if you had the chance to go into where Nancy's sitting now in WNYC and you walk into the newsroom, it's almost like this, I don't want to say ruins, that's a terrible way to describe it, but it's like almost like an action, like things are caught in time. And so when I came in there a year and a half later, there was this big whiteboard in our unit's little pot with all of our little notes on it still about the episodes we were going to make months into the future. We were going to make this episode and this episode, and we were going to do this, and then that was going to happen after. And we had this tidy plan, and all of that went out the window, obviously, because we couldn't even report the stories, we couldn't, they all involved me getting on a plane going somewhere, we couldn't do that. And also I looked at it and thought, how is this helpful to people right now? Like how is something I planned 6 months ago to say to people useful to people sitting in the middle of this crisis, and it was a real crisis of identity for me as a journalist at that moment, of how am I showing up right now? And I thought, I work at this remarkable institution that is not entirely, but largely about opening the mic and being there with people, as we go through this together and bringing people together. And I mean, why am I not doing that? Why would I be in this place and not be engaging why would I be in this place in this time and not be engaging in that way? And so I found it impossible to continue to just make podcasts that I found it literally impossible to show up to work and do that. And so luckily, Karen, my editor, agreed. She was having the same moment, not surprisingly, as she's been with WNYC for 30 plus years. And we decided we needed to change. We needed to be able to be in a place where we could be more present with our community. And same mission, same ideas, same work, and that we could figure out. And so we said, we can figure out how we do some combination of live stuff and our reported pieces. We can figure this out, and luckily, our program director, Jacqueline Sincata, was like a great supporter and was like, absolutely, sure, give it a shot, and so that's what we have spent the last year doing, just trying to figure out, can we take everything we loved about podcasting, the ability to sort of think slow, go out and be intimate, not worry so much about the clock. Can we take all of those things, but do them in the context of a live radio show where somebody can listen and pick up the phone and say, hey, wait a minute, what you just heard, what you just said, that applies to me, or what you just said, I think that's wrong, I think it's like this, and where people might then talk to each other. And so that's the work now. And it's been immensely gratifying because our listeners are there. They were ready for it. I remember we had our first live show the week after the Democratic National Convention, this time, last fall. And as it's a little, when you do a live show, it's a little anxiety provoking. Like, is anyone out there? Is anyone, because the whole thing is like, well, the phones are open. What if no one calls?
Exactly.
It's on Sunday nights. WNYC has not had live radio on the weekends. So Jacqueline too was like, I don't know, is there an audience for this or not? And we opened the phones, and the board was full. And I get emotional thinking about it, and the board was full. I mean, it's like that. Our community was there and ready and excited, and it's been like that. So
when was that exactly?
That would have been, I guess that's late August 2020.
So before the election.
It was the idea was like, let's get there for this election. And we have been quite chaotic, and the format of the show changes almost every day. I just had a long meeting today about, can we really, what is our format? Can't we have a format here? Can we agree on something we do every week? But people are along for the ride,
And what are the differences between, in terms of the work of producing a podcast versus the work that goes into a live show? Like, how do those two compare?
Well, it's difficult to walk. It's kind of walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? Because for a podcast, for a reporting project, you need as much lead time as you can get, and for a live show, you want to be as close to the moment you open the mic as possible. And the real challenge, the real thing we've struggled with is like what is wonderful about a live show is like, you've got, so I sit down and we come up with our idea for the show, and we write the whole thing out and we've got our list of questions. We've thought through some, you know, a producer has done a pre-interview with the guests, found just the right things to talk about, you know, and we write it all out. And then we sit down and start talking, and then someone calls and takes the conversation in a totally different way. And none of that's wrong, you know? That is the joy of live radio, is like to go where it takes you. And that's in opposition to what you're trying to do in a podcast, where you're like trying to drive towards a very specific thing, you know? So I can't really give you an answer to the question because I haven't figured out how to do them both yet. It changes every week. But, you know, part of what we went through a period where we tried to have sort of divide the team and have some people thinking about the pieces we were going to report and produce and craft. And some of us just like, this week, what are we talking about? And just making the live part of the show. I don't think that didn't ultimately work, because that didn't work out, because they didn't come together, you know? And so now we're really more doing it in tandem. And it's more, you know, like today we met to talk about Halloween, right? You know, like what can we produce for Halloween? So it's not a long lead time, but it's a couple of weeks, you know? And so we can like really sort of shoot the moon and try to be more podcasty that day, you know, whereas next week, you know, whatever's the news on Friday, we're going to figure out how to have the best conversation we can about it on Sunday. So we're kind of shifting week to week how we do it. When we know there's a date that we can build something for, we get into podcast mode. And our standard mode is, let's try to respond to what's on people's minds right now and help them think it through the best we can.
I always say to people that the live call-in show is the hardest job. Hosting the live call-in show is the hardest job in radio. I mean, it is just so frightening, and that you basically first, and as you said, you have to hope that people are going to call. And then you have to hope that their questions are questions and that they take you somewhere. And then you have to be listening and responding on the fly while thinking about what the heck you're going to do next, or what you're going to ask your guest, or how you're going to pivot to the next subject, or whatever it is. It's just, it's pretty rough. It's, I mean, you know, Brian does it so seamlessly. Yeah.
Well, I told Brian once early on, I was like, one of the first few, after like first, second, or third time I had guest hosted from him, I was like, oh, what you're doing is intellectual improv, you know? And he was like, yeah, that's kind of it, you know? But for me, the trick to it is submission. like you have to let go of what you entered it with, you know, and that is not something I do easily. And so that is where it's very clear to me, like when you finish the show and you're like, oh, that wasn't the best show, it's usually because I was insistent that I was going to get where I intended to get when I started the show, instead of I went where the conversation took us, you know? And so I think, to me, the trick to it is be prepared, be as smart as you can about the topic at hand, and get ready to genuinely listen. I mean, this is why people love Wright. I mean, I don't know if people know, I mean, there's like literally love. There's like,
yes, they do.
Huge swaths of New York City who have personal love affairs with Brian there. And part of it is because he's like, most of us are bad listeners, you know, and like, he is like the world's best listener. And you can receive that. And so a big part of the work for live radio is just get yourself ready to listen, so that you can meaningfully respond to whatever is the last thing that somebody said, and have a good producer and director who can help you say, okay, the next thing is this, you know, so that you're not doing it on your own.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you probably do this now that you've been doing live radio so much, but just Brian's ability to carry on a conversation with his guest while the producer is talking in his ear. And sometimes, like, I was just amazed, I've been amazed when I've been on his show, how he'll ask me a question, and while I'm answering the question, I see him turn and talk into the mic to his producer and be like fixing, and then he comes back and he was actually listening to what I said because he has a follow-up question. It's just like, wow. Well, speaking of questions, let's go to the Q&A box and see what we have here. I'm reading it right off for the first time. Dustin has a question for you. Kai mentioned that background paragraphs and other things may be cut in radio during editing. What should be cut when editing a podcast where you have more time but still want to keep the listener's attention and tell a compelling story?
One of the things I think, and I'd actually love to hear Nancy's answer this too, as one of the people who's edited me and taught me how to write in radio, is I think cutting distractions. So one of the important things that when you're listening, and you'll notice this as a listener, if you hear something that you can't move on from, and then like the show has gone on and you're still back here on this thing, it's maddening as a listener, and it's undermined yourself as a writer. And so that's one of the most important things, is always, is the thing you've said, is the next thing, does it follow from that? Can people follow along and not get stuck back here? So that's a big part of editing for a podcast, is going through and being like, do you need to say this? Does the listener need this? Because this is a distraction. This is something that is going to get them stuck. And it's a natural way to talk. You've heard me do it all night, is you talk in asides, at least some of us, you get a thought, you're saying something and then you have an aside and then you come back to your thought. That's not helpful to a listener in any format, because now they're over there, but you've got to come back over here, So it's cutting things that don't drive where you're trying to go, and are moving them. It may be like, okay, well, you got to move that. You can say that thing, but you've got to move it to a place where the listener can hear it and keep going. And one of the big errors, I think, is where people, this is true for print writing too, where people say really big things as an aside and then move on. Things that, like, this has to be what you're talking about if you're going to say it. You can't, like, and I'm not going to come up with an example because many of them end up being offensive too, but you can't like use a metaphor or an example or like that is too big that it's the thing you actually need to be talking about. And I find that that's the thing a lot of writers struggle with.
Yes. I mean, I must chime in here as an editor and a writer. I find, sometimes less is more, like that it just works better to not overpack and overload with too many ideas and I have the problem, and our mutual editor, Karen Frillman, makes me change this stuff all the time when I add like just too many names, too many ideas, too much going on in one section. So that's one. And then I also think, though, that something that we do in radio or podcasting is you have to write for the ear. And so you have to write in such a way that a person listening can't back up, as you said, Kai, and reread a sentence that got somehow convoluted or they didn't understand. You have to make it, there's no backing up. So, although in podcasts there kind of is, but so you've got to introduce, like, here's the person you're going to hear, and you have to, and this is what they're talking about. And then you hear them talking and it makes sense because you know who they are and you've already got a frame for where it's going. So it's just, I mean, I think those are kind of some of the tricks of the trade. Let's go on to another question. Patty Whalen, friend of mine. Have you discovered any great podcasts that don't have a big budget or producers? That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of them out there. One of the ones that I literally just discovered and loved was a podcast called Blacks in Appalachia. I think that's the name of it. It's about Black people in Appalachia. And that I'm not pronouncing it right because I know it's Appalachian, I think. I don't know. I can never remember. Anyway, it's an example of, a small group. I'm pretty sure it's just the two of them that work on it. They may have a producer, and a small and a seemingly narrow topic. I mean, this is what is wonderful about podcasting, right? Is like, you don't have to be like, well, it doesn't have to be a morning edition audience, you can say, this is the very specific thing that I am interested in. And I would like to find out more about it and talk about it. And there are some people out there who also will be interested in this. That is a great example of mine. I have my wing of my family is Black and from Appalachia. I came across this thing and I was like, what? There's a podcast about it, and the hosts are just really compelling people. And so that would be my example.
Yeah, good talkers can be successful with just a conversation. Well, I would invite folks to make their podcast recommendations in the chat, and then at the very end, I'll just try to rip through and read them and share them. I'm not sure whether everybody can see the chat with this situation, but throw them in the chat, and then if I need to read them, I will. And here's a question from Martha Raymond, another friend of mine. This is who's here. What is your opinion of the current controversy about Facebook?
Well, it's not going to be an informed one, so I'll start there. I think it's important to point out that I do not report on these things, and so I do not have an informed opinion. I obviously we're all talking about it. I was in a long conversation with my team about it today, and it is my belief that in the end, all of these companies are just too large. They're just too large, and we continue to sort of fuss around in controversy after controversy, but ultimately. They're too big and too powerful to play such a central role in our personal lives and our democracy and in the economy. They just have too much power. And so they will routinely do things that will appall us, because that's what happens when people and things have too much power. That's an ideological belief of mine. Anything that is too powerful is too much power. And so that is my main feeling about Facebook. I do think, and it's hard, the reality is that as a consequence of that, there are huge swaths of life. There's communities certainly around the globe where it is an essential tool for not just like, ooh, I want to hang out and like not do my work, but an essential tool for modern life. And I think that's a tragedy. And shouldn't there be a better way to provide that essential tool than some large private company?
And the impact that the democratization of media has had on the, professional, I guess is the word, media has been enormous. So that's a whole other
It has,
issue.
but I have to say, it like on some level, like, is it democratization of media? Because also, like, more than the impact, like in my experience, like, quote unquote professional media is less impacted by the fact that there's a bunch of people who have stuff to say than the fact that like these platforms have become the publishers and are the gatekeepers to huge swaths of audience, and they have these algorithmic black boxes that can just pick winners and losers in the media market and decide who sees your content and who doesn't. That to me is so. It's actually less. And to me, it's less democratic than ever. Not more democratic. It has the impression of democracy because so many people can sit down at a computer and type things and say things, but very few people can actually be heard unless one of these 2 or 3 big companies decides you're going to be heard. And they decide that in ways that are not transparent. We have no idea. But what we do know is that that are deliberately causing, are deliberately devolving the quality of civic discourse.
Right. Okay, so this is the last call for questions to put them in the Q&A. So we're winding down here. We're going to finish up at 8. So get your questions in, folks. So your pivot to live radio occurs at the same time that the Trump presidency comes to a very wild, crazy end. I mean, that was just a heck of a time. The lead up to the election, and then the November to January, whatever that was, 20th. I mean, it's the 6th, and then beyond the 6th, but to the Biden inauguration. So what was that like for you? And do you feel like, could you feel a sense of like the intensity of what people were experiencing, but then also like, was there any kind of drop off or change after January 6th? Or what was that like from your seat?
You absolutely could feel the intensity. I mean, there's no question. And not just on our show on Sunday nights, but across the station, because I would, if I would be on with Brian, or I would be on, because we were kind of just on the simple level of the number of times we blew up the program schedule and went live because something huge was happening, right? Like, think about the number of times that happened between the DNC and Biden's inauguration. Like, probably more than in the 5 years that I've worked at the station. Like, it was just sort of, I was almost on constant call for, like, Megan Ryan, our head of live radio, texted me and like, we're gonna go live right now. Are you around? Can you just sort of shop in the building for like people who can come get on, So just that alone, like the number of emergencies, and absolutely, you could just feel that people were so eager to be together, and be in conversation and try to understand what was going on. And so it was, for me, extremely gratifying to have an outlet for that, to be able to provide it, to be able to serve people in that way. Was enormously gratifying, because I too was like freaking out and needed to come together and ask questions and have them answered and hear from people, and and have people call in and tell me their experiences that I didn't understand. So it was an intense and historic time, and it felt that way from the other side of the microphone. And I think it was interesting from, the week after Biden's inauguration through the spring, because it was also a moment when vaccines were becoming available, when, you could also feel that change, where there was a definite sort of, all right, we went through that. I don't need that now. And we thought about that as we made the show too. We too were like, I don't need to talk about, like, we spent all February talking about Black History Month. We were like, I need to step away from that for a minute, and I think we had poets on, like, we had we changed tenor dramatically, because also we were a little wrung out from it. And you could feel that in the sort of what people were talking about when they would call, when they would send you voicemails, and the volume of voicemails and calls dipped down, and then it came, and then it, as things, it's really almost, I have to say, follows the path of COVID more than politics, I think. As the Delta variant came and anxieties about that returned, you started to feel again, people feeling like, wait, what's going on? I need to get together. I need to talk. I need to hear. And so I think we're in an interesting moment now where I'm wondering, like, what the fall is going to be like I mean, we're all wondering what the fall is going to be like, right? The fall and winter is going to be like for our lives. But as a host and as a show that's trying to bring people together around these hard issues, I'm genuinely don't know what to expect in terms of how the audience is going to show up. But it has pretty closely mirrored the the emotional ups and downs of society at large around COVID.
Wow, what a wild ride. Here's a good question from Howard Gilman. Ideally, what should be the role of screeners on the call-in shows?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting question. I'm not sure I know how to answer it. I mean, first off, they are doing God's work. So let me just say that. Like, I cannot, because depending on the topic, sometimes it's fine. But depending on the topic, when you give the phone number, you know, because we have this little box that, you know, it's the call box, we call it, you know, so we can see all the phone lines as the hosts and the producers, you know, and as the calls come in, like each box lights up to represent a call. And on hot nights, like within, you know, minutes, you know, the whole thing is full. And those people there's another human being who's like on the other end of those blinking lights, trying to like just take in what people are giving them. So one, it's God's work and it's really, really hard. And I imagine it's different for every show. What they're doing is we've talked in advance about this is the kind of caller we're hoping to get. These are, you know, we've gotten to where we do an exercise where we're like, we start with like, what do we want to hear a call? What would be the great call? If somebody called in and said this, what would it be? You know, and then we work backwards of like, okay, what's the question to ask that would generate that would get that person to pick up the phone and call? So they go in with that, knowing that, and that's what they're looking for. You know, and they're trying to figure out, you know, it's also like they are minding the clock. You know, it's 7:59. If this were a live radio show, we would have a minute. We might want to sneak in one more caller. They need to know which caller can say what they need to say in 10 seconds instead of is going to take 5 minutes and now I'm going to have to cut them off and sound rude, you know? They are producing the show in the sense of trying to find the right person. It's almost akin to the writing thing that we're talking about in terms of they're looking for someone for calls that will move the conversation forward in a way that won't derail it, but that will drive it someplace new. The last thing I'll say on that is that they know the questions that we have written in advance. And the ideal callers are people who have one of those questions, who can say, you don't answer the question. We'd rather let the caller ask the question.
Well, and I'll just chime in because I do the Ask Governor Murphy show, which was monthly, and we're kind of on hold during the election season, but we'll be back. And you know, one of the things that we do when we're choosing the calls is, you know, you could have all the lines lit up because people are furious that they can't get through to the unemployment office and they want the governor to do something about it. And so we could put one of those callers on, or even two of them, but you really, as a listener, aren't going to want to listen to 8 people with the same question. So that's another role for a screener,
right,
is just to get a mix of questions. And, you know, and then we do, you know, with a call-in show where it's constituents asking questions of the governor, then, you know, you want to kind of weed out the questions that are very, very personal, that are like, you know, the pothole in front of my house kind of questions. And you want to get to more of like the policy issues. Even you want people to tell their personal experience, but you want it to be related to something that other people are having a problem with as well. So I would just add those as other options. And then there are always people who are certifiably crazy. And maybe we should take some more of those calls. I don't know, but that can also really derail the conversation.
right.
Okay, we've run through all the questions and we're at 8 o'clock. So it's a perfect time to stop. Thanks, Kai, for coming to Maplewood and doing this with us. And people don't know this, but Kai actually has spent quite a bit of time in Maplewood because he has close friends there.
Some of my favorite people on the universe are in Maplewood.
And I'll hand it back to Amanda. I think she wants to say goodbye.
Just thank you both so much. This was such a great evening, and it's really just an honor to have you both here. So thank you for your time and for your contributions to the radio and to our lives each day. Please, for those of you who want to keep track of what's happening at the library, please sign up for our newsletter on our website at www.maplewoodlibrary.org, and keep track of what's happening with the construction at our foundation website at www.maplewoodlibraryfoundation.org. And thank you both again so much. This was wonderful.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Good
Bye,
night,
everybody.
everyone.
Night.